Here is a question from a student. What is, in general, the purpose of mankind on earth?
That too is a profound question, and I thank you for asking it. You can look at it different ways. You can look at it as a skeptic and say there is no purpose, you have to make it, and that's what they tell you. Stephen Jay Gould from Harvard University, the paleontologist, no meaning. Friedrich Nietzsche, no meaning. Jean-Paul Sartre, no meaning. You can see many skeptics in this culture who say absolutely no meaning, life is meaningless. Jean-Paul Sartre, it's an empty bubble floating on the sea of nothingness. If you were to ask a pantheist from the reincarnational viewpoint, your purpose is to pay for the karmic cycle of the previous life, and you go on and on and on and on and on till you have exhausted the karma and you get absorbed into the imperfect, impersonal absolute. To the perfect, impersonal absolute, as it were. You see, in all of those systems, there is something that is swallowed up, that you as an individual ultimately lose your individuality. Think of that. You as an individual lose your individuality. When you look at the gospel of Jesus Christ, the greatest thing He does for you as He offers you His love and forgiveness is to affirm you as an individual. The word individual comes from the Latin, which cannot be divided. You are a composite whole. You are a composite whole. One entity. And God gives you that life. He has wired you. He has made you. He has uniquely gifted you as an individual. He wants you to live out that individuality in the distinctive way in which He's made you. My wife Margie often says, I marvel at the fact that a handful of features have 1 billion different faces to them. The nose, the eyes, the lips, the mouth, different features. But that's the way we are even internally, uniquely different. What is the purpose of life? The purpose for which God has made you is to understand the sacredness of your life and the sacredness of worship. So let me give you this definition given by Archbishop William Temple. Worship is the submission of all of our nature to God. It is the quickening of conscience by His holiness, nourishment of mind by His truth, purifying of imagination by His beauty, opening of the heart to His love, and submission of will to His purpose. All this gathered up in adoration is the greatest expression of which we are capable. In other words, life is diverse. Its ultimate expression is one. Quickening of conscience by His holiness, mind by His truth, imagination by His beauty, heart to His love, and submission of will to His purpose. All this gathered up in adoration is the greatest expression of which we are capable. Now here's the analogy I want to give to you. In marriage, you see that pristine analogy. A man and a woman in a consummate relationship of the sacredness of marriage. The word, the body, the action, the life, the meaning, everything in one expression. That's why they say the two shall become one. In Christian ceremonies, for example, the 2 lit candles light one, 2 are put out, the 1 candle stands. There is an intermeshing of 2 lives. The 2, in a sense, seeking to live for the other. That is merely symbolic of what God does in you when He comes to live inside you and changes your hungers. You see, in the worldview of reincarnation that you've represented, the ultimate goal is union with the divine. There's one capital I. There is no you. Diversity is obliterated. Some form of impersonal singularity remains. In the Christian faith, there's unity and diversity and community. As you are relating to God, the goal is not union, the goal is communion. Now, when you start from that, God Himself, the being of Trinity, love in relationship. Let me repeat that. Love in relationship. The goal of life must be to reflect that person of God in a loving relationship first with Him and then with our fellow human beings. When you have love and when you have relationship with God, that supreme purpose is filled, and out of the overflow, you love your fellow human beings. That's why he said the greatest commandment was to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and strength and mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Love with that capital L, represented in the person of God, shown in the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Communing with you, that begins to give you the purpose of life. That is the generality from which the particularities actually follow. If you understand this, you will understand the mess we are in today. Take the whole issue of gay marriages. The world is now wrestling with it. And whatever one might think, I want to say this to you. When you desacralize sexuality and the body, you will desacralize life itself. I remember a woman from the ABC News saying to me, and this is very pertinent to what my answer is, so bear with me. She had come to Indiana University in Bloomington, and one of the anchors had sent her there to tape, and she said, I'm only going to stay 10 minutes. She stayed 3.5 hours, taped everything. Walking back to where I was staying, and she said to me, I do have a question for you. She said, I've really been deeply moved by what you've said tonight, and I'm really thinking about what you said, Mrs. Zacharias, but I have a question. She said, I don't understand something. Christians are against racism. They don't like racial prejudice. I hear them talk about it all the time. But then they discriminate against certain forms of sexuality. Why are they against one when you discriminate against race, but they're not against the other? I said, ma'am, I think I can answer your question. It was dark. We were walking, my colleagues, myself, and she was next to me. She said, the microphones are not on. This is between you and me. I said, okay. I said, the reason we don't have the same response is because it is based on the same reason. Race is sacred. Sex is sacred. You cannot desacralize race. You cannot desacralize sexuality. You have to tell me, man, how you treat race as sacred and desacralize sexuality. You have to tell me that. You know, she paused and she looked at me and she said, I want to thank you for the answer. I have never thought of it in those terms. When God gave us the 10 Commandments, you shall have no other gods before me. Worship is sacred. You shall not commit adultery. Sexuality is sacred. You shall not steal. Property is sacred. Remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. Time is sacred. Honor your father and your mother. Your home is sacred. Do you know the greatest gift God has given to you is to tell you that you are a sacred individual, inviolable? And your purpose is when you find that sacredness with Him. Listen to what the Apostle Paul said in Acts 17. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by hands. He's not served by human hands as if He needed anything, because He Himself gives all men life and breath and everything else. From one man He made every nation of men that they should inhabit the whole earth, and He determined the time set for them and the exact places where they should live. Please listen now. God did this so that men would seek Him and perhaps reach out for Him and find Him, though He is not far from each one of us. To you, my fellow Indians, I say this. This is one of the greatest nations on the face of the earth. Some of the brightest minds in the world today are from here. I go into space technology institutes, universities, medical facilities, and I see the brightest minds of India in there, absolutely brilliant. God's given you and me the privilege in our ethnicity of being born Indian. That gift, naturalism cannot give to any human being. Every race and every ethnic group is a gift of God to that person. Whether you're Caucasian, whether you're Oriental, whether you're Occidental, whether you're American, whether you're Canadian, whatever that race is, whether you're African American, that gift is a pure gift to you. Naturalism cannot give it. Reincarnational processes do not give it. It's God's pristine gift to you as an individual. When you find the sacredness of your life and your individuality blending with His and worshiping Him, the sanctity of worship, the sanctity of the Word, the sanctity of life, the sanctity of time, the sanctity of property, then we look at our fellow man as a fellow sacred human being. When Jacob and Esau had quarreled and parted for many years, they finally met, and Jacob was afraid that his brother was going to have vengeance on him. And his brother looked at him and said, "No, I now see in your face the face of God." God planned where you would be born, and He is not far from any one of us. Your purpose is to know Him and make Him known. From that, everything else flows. Thank you for that question.
If God is all-powerful, all-knowing, why would He still choose to create a world where it's going to fall apart and we're going to have atrocities like we have now, when He knows that that's going to be the outcome of what we choose?
Yeah. Okay, when you deal with the whole effect, which is what we are living in, whatever the cause, when we deal with the effect, what we have now, you have 3 or 4 possible options. One option is that it would have been better to have no creation at all than to have this one. Okay? Number 2, would it have been better if He'd only created people who would only choose good? That's the second option. Number 1, no creation. Number 2, where we would only choose good. Number 3, where there were no such thing as good. It'd be better if He'd created a world where there was no such thing as good or evil, an amoral world. Or, as far as we know, the only other option is, or this world where there's a possibility of good and evil, knowing that we would still choose evil and all the entailments that you have mentioned here. So no creation, only good, no such thing as good or evil, or this particular world. It is interesting, when we raise the question, we metaphysically introduce a moral framework. Would it have been better? Would it have been better? Would it have been better? If it had been morally better, the only reason to justify the question again is that there is such a thing as good or evil. Otherwise, the question is moot or self-defeating. Now, since we invoke a moral framework, and you cannot invoke a moral framework in an amoral world, then the question is, what is the ultimate ethic? And the ultimate ethic, as I see it, is the ethic of love. And so this world may not be the best of all possible worlds, but it may be the best of all possible means to the best of all possible worlds. So I think that created order with the envisionment of love as the supreme ethic still makes the possibility the supreme ethic which the other 3 worlds would not have made possible at all.
I don't know if you're familiar with the movie Silence of the Lambs, but in that movie...
Please say that again, familiar?
The movie Silence of the Lambs.
Yes.
In that movie, there's a psychotic but brilliant guy named Hannibal Lecter who questions Clarice, who's trying to analyze him. Are you uncomfortable with the fact that maybe I'm just evil without sense or reason? So along with that, is man inherently born evil with the need for Christ to make that man good? Or are we born inherently good with sin and evil just damaging our inherent goodness?
Great question. It is interesting, again, I think the Judeo-Christian worldview again stands very distinctively here. Remember, for example, the teaching of Gautama Buddha is that all suffering is a result of desire. He doesn't call it sin, he calls it desire. So if you eliminate desire, you'll eliminate suffering. And I remember talking to a group of Buddhist scholars once when I wrote my book, The Lotus and the Cross, Jesus Talks to Buddha. And I was doing an interview with them in Thailand and Malaysia and all of that. And I asked them if indeed the desire is the source of all suffering. And if you eliminate desire, then suffering itself is eliminated. I said, can you explain to me why the Dalai Lama desires the liberation of Tibet? If he has reached that plateau of being the perfect human being, as it were, why does he still desire the liberation of Tibet? There was silence in the room. And one of them said, because he chooses to. And we had a fascinating discussion at the end of that. Is he choosing to be less than what he knows to be right as the perfect human being? And the more we talked, it became inescapable to discuss the issue that humanity's will is fallen. Our desires are to serve ourselves. When Christ comes into your life, he doesn't tell you to stop desiring. This is the only faith in the world that talks about a supernatural regeneration. It's a new birth, so that he changes your hungers and he changes what you want. He doesn't tell you to stop hungering. He said, blessed are those that hunger and thirst after righteousness. Fallen humanity does not mean that we cannot do anything good. It ultimately demonstrates that what separates us from God is not goodness or badness. What separates us from God is spiritual deadness. Jesus didn't come into the world to make bad people good. He came into the world to make dead people live. And you and I are spiritually dead, separated. And when he comes and changes you, there are many people who are atheists who live very good lives, who may do many good things. But the issue then is that goodness then the badge of honor to merit some kind of accolade? And Christ says, no, we are all lost. And ultimately, and that's why, by the way, Mahatma Gandhi said this. He said the most enigmatic thing about any religion is in the Christian faith. It's the cross. There's nothing like it. Martin Luther King Jr. so often spoke of the cross as that which kept motivating and driving him. Why the cross? Because of your condition and mine. The problem is that our morality will not change us. We are spiritually separated. So the Bible says we are born separated from God. And that separation can only be bridged by God himself.
Hello, Dr. Zacharias. I'm wondering, how do you reconcile God's sovereignty with natural evil? You mentioned moral evil in your discussion, but I heard no mentioning of natural evil. Say the earthquake in Pakistan.
Yeah, I'll be happy to do that. And actually, I've written a fair bit on the subject, and I'll be happy to give you a brief answer. And I don't want to keep the others waiting too long. See, we've all got lined up now. This is great. It is interesting who asks that question. The atheist doesn't really have no right to ask the question because it's not a moral framework he or she operates with. I was asked that question on Fox News, and I said, who's asking the question? The atheist has no philosophical base on which to ask it. The Hindu is really not asking it because it's karma. The Muslim, it's inshallah, it's the will of God. So the only one who legitimately asks the question, who is conceding to the Judeo-Christian worldview. And if the question is legitimate, then the Judeo-Christian worldview must be legitimized in the process, if it's a legitimate question. Otherwise, it's an illegitimate question. But if it is a legitimate question, then you have to answer it in a paradigm. The paradigm of God's creation and purpose, humanity's violation of that purpose, the entailments of that violation are both internal brokenness, external brokenness, brokenness in relationship to the elements and the powers that are around us. He warned us this would happen. In fact, he even told us in the end times the rapidity will increase. And the earthquakes and the wars and the rumors of wars, he is so specific. There are incredible number of specifics given. So you have to think in paradigms. Now, what happens with the paradigm is there comes a breaking point in that paradigm. The paradigm is this, that God is created with purpose and design. You violate the purpose and design, you reap the consequence of brokenness all around you, and broken relationships with humanity, broken relationships with the world order itself. And that's why even the Apostle Paul talks about the creation that groans ultimately for restoration. But you know, during the Second World War, there was a marvelous book written by a Frenchman about the Chambonnais, the people in Le Chambon, where there was an undercover movement by some in the church who were rescuing the Jews that were being hunted down by the Nazis. Now, the writer was not at all sympathetic to the religious belief that he was talking about, but he said, what startled me is this, that I was getting coarser and coarser in my thinking as I saw the atrocity one after another. I was getting hardened towards suffering. When you've seen 10 die, it hurts for the first time. Next time, it'll take 20 dying for you to feel the same way. In other words, he said there was an encrustation on my heart so that it was impervious to pain. Until one day, I saw a handful of these young people picking up broken bodies and binding them up in Le Chambon. He said that hard encrustation broke and my heart was made tender again. I think in the tragedies like tsunami and natural disasters, it is very much within the paradigm of the Christian worldview. It is not outside the paradigm. But our responsibility in all of those hardnesses is still to go and reach out and touch with the love of Jesus Christ to keep hearts from becoming harder. In the answer, in the love of Christ, we've come here to help you. Nothing more than that. So in the paradigm, it fits natural disasters, tragedies, and atrocities. The answer is not to stand back and watch it happen, to give the love of Christ so that the encrusted heart can be softened. And I've given more detailed answers in this in one of my books, Cries of the Heart, and dealing with the issue of Job.
How do you respond to people like Richard Dawkins who say that morality has to evolve for the survival of the community and because they could pass on their genes to their progeny?
By the way, our organization, the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics, has just acquired a brand new location very close to Richard Dawkins' house in Oxford University. So we pray as he bicycles by every day, he will see that beautiful Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics building out there. Now, what he's referring to is my comment in some of my arguments for morality. When people say there's too much of evil in this world, therefore there isn't a God, my response is to help them frame the question. I say, when there's such a thing as evil, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as good? When you say there's such a thing as good, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil? But when you say there's such a thing as a moral law, you must posit a moral lawgiver, but that's whom they're trying to disprove and not prove. Because if there's no moral lawgiver, there's no moral law. If there's no moral law, there's no good. If there's no good, there's no evil. The question actually self-destructs. You have to be able to posit the basis of good and evil. And by the way, that is why Richard Dawkins, in his lectures on Voltaire at the British Humanist Association, actually went so far as to say that he denied such a thing as evil actually existed. He denies the reality of evil. And the reason he denied the reality of evil is because he's got to posit it with some ontic referent, some point of transcendent reference to which he has no claim. So now he is sort of playing footsies with the terms again and then says it has actually evolved. So I would say to him, is he claiming to be more evolved than some other tribal places where they are maybe slaughtering each other? Are those people less evolved than he has? What is his basis of a height of rightness? Because he must at some point make some condemnation of something that is morally wrong. And he must then say that that person has not properly evolved, either culturally or in human terms or environmentally, that they are less evolved than he is. Here's the point that I think is unshakable. First of all, he completely ignores the heinousness of what evil really is. I remember being in a country I shall leave unnamed. And I had just taken off from there. The plane was just a few years ago. It was heading on to Hanoi, making a stop on the way. And a Dutch woman was sitting next to me. We got into a conversation. And we were both very guarded. She asked me what I did. I didn't say too much about it. I said, well, I teach. I'm a professor, this and that. You want to be careful because you don't want to kill the conversation very quickly. And I asked her what she did. She said she was in humanitarian work. And the more we began to unpack each other's life, we found out we actually both followed the Lord. And she was involved in the rescue of children in sexual abuse. I won't name the country. I said, were you successful here? She said, yes. She said, it's a very painful place to be. She said, in fact, last night, I was in an area of the city. If I haven't told you the name of the city, you'll know which country I'm referring to, so I won't name it. She said, we're in this part of the city where men come at the end of the day and they are given a concoction of snake's blood and hard liquor. It ravages the mind. They consume that and they ask for whatever it is they have wanted and they've come there for. She said, Mr. Zacharias, last night I rescued an 18-month-old baby girl from the hands of a man who was sexually raping this little child. That's what he had come for, a baby. Is that evil? Is that evil? Or if you say the man, his mind is ravaged, what about the man who's making this possible for him? And the hundreds of people involved, and yet the thousands in the network. If you've seen the movie Slumdog Millionaire, you see what is done to children. I asked a man in Kerala, South India, whether this is an accurate portrayal of what is done to some of these children. He said, my colleague Walter was with me in the car. He said, I'm involved in that same work here, rescuing of children. He said, that movie was mild compared to what? Is that evil? To take and pour acid into a child's eyes in order to make your money and to make your living? Now, here's the point I want to say to you. When you say there's evil, there's such a thing as good. When you say there's such a thing as good, you have to posit a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil. But if you posit a moral law, you have to posit a moral lawgiver. That's where Richard Dawkins has a problem. He says, why do I have to posit a moral lawgiver? My answer to him is this. Every question of evil either is raised by a person or else about a person. Either raised by a person or about a person, which means the concept of personhood is inextricably bound to the moral impetus of the question. And you cannot have the moral impetus in the question unless you have essential worth to personhood. And the only way to have essential worth to personhood is if there is a transcendent, moral, valuable, intrinsically worthy first cause. By virtue of him, we have that intrinsic worth, not because it's been conveyed by state or culture or any other power. So if intrinsic worth is indispensable for the validity of the question, the only way to justify intrinsic worth is if we are created by a being of worth, and therefore the question is only valid if worth is intrinsic, and worth is not intrinsic if we are not a part of a created order but randomly evolved from time plus matter plus chance. So evil self-destructs with the notion that human worth is nothing more than matter and culture, but evil is real when you see the essential worth of a person. And that's why the question is always raised by a person or about a person, which means personal value is indispensable. And you need a transcendent moral first cause in order to justify moral worth and personhood. That's my answer to them. Yeah.
Well, in dealing with that, following along regarding what truth is and how can we be so certain that objective, absolute truth actually does exist? And even if absolute truth does exist, how do we know for sure that the truth is when we are situated beings with our own presuppositions? How do we determine and discern between the absolutism of truth and our own preferences as well as our presupposition? How do we engage with moral relativists?
I think there's an enormous confusion in our culture between the existence of truth and how we know what truth is. So one deals with the reality of the nature of truth and reality of the world as it is, and is there independent objectively of what I know or not, and my ability to know that. I think every philosophical and spiritual person admits that the one is easier to sort of state, the second is harder to define. So I can say truth exists. Now, for instance, if I'm dealing with reality and I say the reality of the stool, you know, I can touch it, feel it, sense it, kick it, and find out that there's a realness to it. Now, to try and demonstrate and defend that sometimes becomes sometimes a bit of the challenge. But what I find often with the relativist persons, they make a jump that because we can't capture by definitional terms exact expressions, therefore truth doesn't exist. But that's to confuse, again, how we know with what we know. I think the fact is, even the person the relativist, as we've said earlier, a person said there's no such thing as truth, has to employ the very thing. They have to mean it is true that there is no such thing but truth. But if it is true that there is no such thing, what are we saying? Either saying nothing or we're just confused. And so I think the independent nature of reality, its existence, is undeniable. The knowing process, how do we go through that? I'll pass that to one of my two colleagues so I don't hog this.
A part of the question was defining truth, and one way to start when answering that question is to say that is a correspondence view of truth, which says that truth is what corresponds to reality. And if anybody objects to that, you can say that any attempt to deny the correspondence view of truth uses the correspondence theory of truth in saying that their view corresponds to reality and your view does not. And so they cannot deny that truth exists, and with what Stuart was saying, also that it can be known. Those are two separate questions. So first, defining what truth is, showing that any other attempt to define truth in any other way, that you cannot know it. Like truth is what coheres, or truth is what is comprehensive, or truth is what feels good. Any of these other attempts to define truth all point back to the correspondence theory that says you cannot deny that it exists, and then knowing it is a separate question.
And the flip side of that, just as they've answered, the flip side of that is examining relativism. So if relativism says that all truth is relative, that statement either includes itself or excludes itself. If it includes itself, that means that statement is also not always true. But if it includes itself, then it's denying an absolute while positing an absolute at the same time, so it self-destructs. Relativism simply cannot be true because of the very nature of the law of non-contradiction. Now, when we were at the University of Washington, a young woman stood up and she said, I have read the Bible, I am not a Christian, I don't find the Bible exciting at all, but I'm a very spiritually minded young woman. What is wrong with my spirituality? Why do I have to become a Christian? And I began my talk, interestingly enough, with a story. Let me get back to her question and the way I worked backwards. I said, if I woke up one morning and told my wife that I have now begun to worship the green cheese goddess, and I buy green cheese anywhere I can find it and offer sacrifices to the green cheese goddess, and I'm going to go around the globe propagating the reality of the green cheese goddess. The only problem with the green cheese goddess is as soon as anybody else wants to get in touch with the green cheese goddess disappears. But you have to take my word for it, that the green cheese goddess exists. I said, if I told my wife that every morning that I'm going to go to a temple to worship the green cheese goddess, what do you think she would do with me? One of them is to have my head examined, wondering why is this green cheese goddess the focus of my life? And she nodded. I said, now I take you back to an opening illustration I gave you. The opening illustration was a trial of two young girls, minors, who were accusing a man of raping them in England. My wife, my children, and I were all attending that trial. And the two gals weren't there. They could only be seen on monitors. And we saw the man being accused, and we were described what happened. The girls said on this particular day, they walked into their home, and it was bizarre, it was horrific. And I kept looking at that man and saying, what kind of a human being is he? The defense attorney stood up after the lengthy arguments, and he looked at the gals on the monitor and said, I just want one question answered. One thing known, nothing more. I just want to know the truth. Do you understand me? I don't want you to tell me long stories. I don't want to make it difficult. I just want to know one thing. What is the truth? Do you girls understand me? He said, yes. He said, my questions now are these. If you don't understand them, stop me. Is it true that you told your parents of what happened 2 months after it happened? Pause. Yes. In the 2 months, did anybody examine you physically to find out what had happened before the 2 months or after the 2 months? No. And he went through a series. Now, is it true that on the day you told your parents, he'd seen you in the heart of the city that day doing something that you ought not to have been doing, and he told you he was going straight to your parents at the end of the day to tell them what he saw you doing? Is it true? One of them remained silent. The other one said, I can't remember. And the story began to unfold, and the case began to implode under its own weight. There were 2 of us men, 4 of us women who walked out of there, and all 6 of us said one thing. What really happened that day, we don't know. And I said to her, is it important that that courtroom know the truth of what happened on that day? She said, yes. It is equally important and infinitely more important that your spirituality be based on truth and not just on fanciful imagination. She nodded and accepted. Truth is the most valuable thing in the world. It's the most valuable thing in the world. And once you know the truth, Jesus said, it will set you free because you can correspond to reality as it really is.
You made reference to those in the Middle East who hold absolute values, but it might seem that that's an area of the world where there's a lot of taking of human life, and it seems like these things aren't valued as much as they are in our society.
Yep, it's a very good point. And that's really the point I'm trying to make when you look at a worldview that has absolutes. And then you are part of a worldview that has no absolutes. In a pluralistic society, the one who believes in absolutes will somehow take hold and sway the culture in that direction. So what does a culture do to make sure that the absolutes you believe in are defendable and rationally tenable? I think that's the important question. Every absolute is based on a worldview, and your question could not be more important than the question really in our time. Let me give this to you as a painful illustration, and I don't mean any offense to anyone here, but your question, I think if it is not properly broached and understood, breeds a kind of a lackadaisical attitude in the West that we can hold on to our relativism, and at no cost. I remember going to a university in Jerusalem. I did my research for a book that I'm writing, and so some of you may be interested in knowing, I met with the Grand Mufti, who's the third most influential leader in Islam, spent time with him, and then I spent time with a professor of Islamic studies at Bethlehem University. And it was very cordial. I told him who I was, I told him what I was writing, I told him I was a Christian philosopher, and I was doing some research on the two worldviews. And I said to him, I said, now you tell me that in your belief there is no compulsion in religion. Is that right? He said, that is right. And he quoted the surah, that there is no compulsion in religion. I said, can I ask you something, sir? I said, you have a daughter. It's 22. He said, yeah. I said, if your daughter today became a Christian, what would you do? I promise you, this is exactly what he said without batting an eyelid. He said, I'll kill her. I said, pardon me? He said, I'd kill her. I said, I thought you told me there's no compulsion in religion. He said, I'll do everything in my power to keep her from coming to that point. So here's what I said to him. Don't you think freedom to believe must also come with hand in hand with freedom to disbelieve? And if your absolute is defendable, why are you defending it by taking blood rather than reasoning with the person and talking and sharing why what you believe is the truth? So what I say to you, sir, is this. Every absolute is based on a worldview. Make a note of that. Every absolute is based on a worldview. A worldview is answering 4 questions: origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. And I believe that is why the Christian worldview to me is the only worldview that answers those 4 questions correspondingly and coherently and respects the sanctity of your life to disbelieve it if you choose to. The moment an absolute is based on a worldview that is hegemonic, that seeks to dominate, that enforces its belief, then there's a problem with the worldview. So absolutes don't hang in midair. Absolutes have to be grounded. And it is the worldview that needs to be examined. More and more I'm convinced when people make pronouncements, they are pronouncing it on the basis of a worldview without ever bothering to defend the worldview. That's why the worldview of secularization, pluralization, and privatization is walking through a minefield. We have to be able to defend the questions that we ask and the answers that we give. So you're right, an absolute in the part of the world today that is shedding so much blood is an absolute that has to give us a worldview first. And if that worldview is untenable, then that absolute is untenable too. And so you examine the worldview behind the absolute, and you will find that the worldview is the problem, and that's why the absolute is erroneously taken. We talk, we discuss. I believe our worldview must be examined, and the unexamined worldview is not worth living. The problem is not with the absolute that is held. The problem is the absolute that is unanchored to a coherent worldview. And that's why you've got the problem there.
You mentioned once that pluralism, that is a diversity of ideas, is good, but also that it leads us to lose reason because it leads us to relativism. So where and how do you draw a line between pluralism and relativism?
Great question. Where and how do you draw the line between pluralism and relativism? When you go back in the history of thought and you'll see the shifting priorities of the way people were making decisions. When you go back to the 13 and 1400s, you've got the Renaissance. Art is holding sway. Man is the measure of all things. On the heels of that came the Enlightenment thinkers, somebody like Immanuel Kant, and the bridging between empiricism and rationalism was being sought in some fashion. So you have the Renaissance, you have rationalism, you have the bridging between empiricism and rationalism. Then you come into the middle of the 19th century, actually the early part of the 20th century, where existentialism takes hold, and now you come into postmodernism. These isms and these ideas were focusing on single strands of defining ultimate reality. So for the Renaissance man, it was sort of man the measure of all things, art and creativity and so forth. For rational man, it was reason and intellect. For empirical man, it was the sciences and measuring truth from the empirically verifiable point of view. For the existentialist, it became emotion and will. For the postmodernist, it's sort of there's no such thing as absolutes. You define your own reality, and he moves in that postmodern world, rejecting all these other isms that have preceded. Now, when we went through all of this, there was one defining decision that was made in the 18th century. And the defining decision was this, that one way or the other, we have to arrive at a moral framework, whether we like it or not, to live and let live. How do you find that morality amongst these differing ways of looking at things? And the answer that Immanuel Kant gave was that by my reason I was going to be able to arrive at that. Now you must understand this, that my unaided reason, he said, I do not need the Christ standing in front of me to give that to me. Now, Kant was a churchman, but what Immanuel Kant was trying to say is, you can find human reason as the source for moral parameters, and that's how we will learn to live and let live. Now listen to the words of Kai Nielsen, possibly the best known Canadian atheistic writer, talking about this. Here's what he says. We have been unable to show that reason requires the moral point of view, or that really rational persons need not be egoists or classical amoralists. Reason doesn't decide here. The picture I have painted for you is not a pleasant one for me, and reflection on this actually depresses me. Pure practical reason, even with the good knowledge of the facts, will not take you to morality. That's quite a statement from an atheistic thinker. So if for you and me to live peaceably, we need a moral point of reference that protects you and me. You're raising a titanic question for a pluralistic culture, and my answer is, unless we believe in a transcendent framework of reference to right and wrong, relativism will hold sway, and relativism is self-destructive and mutually contradictory. So, how is it then that we find an answer to this? To me, every culture has to have certain principles that are inviolable. The sacredness of life, the sacredness of the human body, in its inviolability, and on the basis of that, in the free marketplace of ideas, one has to debate it and try to defend it in an open and a free and a democratic society. But if you violate the sanctity of life right from the beginning, then your absolute goes into the mode of high gear in relativism, and destruction begins. For example, Arnold Toynbee said, the Western culture is the first culture that is trying to build its entire ethos without a moral framework to back it up. For the Hebrews, it was the Ten Commandments. Other parts of the Middle East was the Code of Hammurabi. The other cultures have come up with something in order to treat as their inviolable nature. The capitalistic, democratic Western world is living on a whim that they don't have to have this frame of reference and it'll be okay. I'm just telling you, it will not be okay. When Nietzsche wrote his God is Dead, Nietzsche made the point. He said, now that God has philosophically died in the 19th century, two things will happen in the 20th century. Number one, it'll become the bloodiest century in history. And number two, a universal madness will break out. In the 20th century, we killed more people in warfare than the previous 19 put together. And a kind of a lunacy has broken out. Charles Darwin said it when he wrote The Descent of Man. He said, if my scientific theory is established, the philosophical extrapolation will mean more bloodshed and more violence unparalleled. This last year, Thomas Wolfe has written a book on hedonism in the American campus. And when he was interviewed on the 26th of December and asked when this change came in Western society, he said, when Nietzsche said, God is dead. So Western society has to ask itself the question, what is the moral point of reference for it? If it has none, some other moral point of reference will come. That's why the first thing God did, by the way, when he brought the people out of bondage into the promised land, was he gave them the 10 commandments, giving the sanctity of life, the sanctity of your word, the sanctity of your property, the sanctity of your neighbor, the sanctity of time, the sanctity of worship. That was the blueprint on which everything else hung. If you don't have a moral law, somebody else who claims a moral law will ultimately take over, because he or she will be willing to pay with his or her life for an absolute.
I heard you speaking before about morality and empathy, and it seemed to me that you said that we have these empathetic feelings because of something endowed to us by God. And currently I'm taking philosophy, a couple of classes, and every time we discuss morality or empathy, when we are giving reasons, we're not allowed to refer to any religious authorities. And I was wondering how you might reconcile that, or how you might address that issue.
Be very happy to do that. How do you reconcile the idea of an absolute morality when the naturalistic framework rejects that framework, but gives other, whatever it is, bioethical reasons or whatever it is, chemistry and so on and so forth? Here's the syllogism. Objective moral values only exist if God exists. Objective moral values do exist. Therefore, God exists. Now, if somebody wants to challenge that, they either have to challenge your premises or your validity. Do objective moral values exist or not? If they do not exist, then you also have to say that no such thing as evil exists. Richard Dawkins, and by the way, I'm associated now with Oxford University. I'm a regular lecturer there, so I'm on the faculty of Wycliffe Hall. And at Oxford is Richard Dawkins, the bulldog of Darwinism. Dawkins actually came to a point in his own belief that there's no such thing as evil. And he talked about a chef who did a show on the BBC and cooked placenta, human placenta, with garlic, lime juice and shallots and all of that, served a pâté, even to the father. And he said the father had several helpings and said it was very nice. He said, now, I've got the quote from him. He said, I want to say this. Eating a placenta is eating your baby's clone. He said, science can't tell you whether it's right or wrong to do that, but it can tell you that's what it's doing. Then you decide for yourself whether it's right or wrong. Would he believe that if I chose to carve up one of his children with a butcher knife just because I liked it? Or would he call a court of justice? Would he call me to order? Will he want somebody like me incarcerated? What he really wants is a prerogative for his own definition of right and wrong, but it doesn't give me the privilege and the prerogative of doing so. So objective moral values have to exist. If objective moral values don't exist, no condemnation on any moral judgment may be legitimately made without you retaining the sovereignty over the other person to whom you're not giving the sovereignty. So are some things true objectively, whether we believe it or not? And if they're true, they can only exist if God exists. Because I remember when I was speaking at Nottingham, a student stood up and said, there's so much of evil in this world, how can there be a God? I said, when you say there's such a thing as evil, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as good? He said, yeah. I said, when you assume there's such a thing as good, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as a moral law? on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil. He sort of stuttered through that one. So I had to help him. I said, when Bertrand Russell debated the Jesuit philosopher Frederick Copleston, at this point, Copleston had Russell pinned with his back to the wall and said, Mr. Russell, do you believe in right and wrong? Bertrand Russell said, yes. Copleston said, how do you differentiate between right and wrong, good and bad? He said, the same way I differentiate between blue and green. Copleston said, wait a minute, you differentiate between blue and green by seeing, don't you? He said, yes. How do you differentiate between good and bad? Here's this brilliant mathematician philosopher. Here's his answer. On the basis of feeling, what else? Copleston let him away lightly. Somebody should have looked at Bertrand Russell and said, Mr. Russell, in some cultures they love their neighbors. In other cultures they eat them. Do you have a personal preference? So there has to be a basis of differentiating between good and bad other than your feeling. And so he said, all right, I'll grant you that. I said, okay, what you've granted me is that if there's such a thing as evil, there's such a thing as good. He said, yeah. I said, there's such a thing as good, there's such a thing as a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil. He said, that is correct. I said, but if you have such a thing as a moral law, there has to be a transcendental moral law and therefore a transcendental moral lawgiver. Otherwise, there is no moral law. If there's no transcendence of this moral law, there's no moral law. If there's no moral law, there's no good. If there's no good, there's no evil. I said, what is your question? I promise you this is exactly what happened. He stood there, looked at me and said, what then am I asking you? You cannot escape the long reach of a moral framework without committing rational suicide. That's why even the famed Australian atheist Mackey said, the problem is rationally justifying any such thing as morally wrong. Guy Nielsen of Calgary, probably the most prolific atheistic writer in Canada, said it bothers him endlessly that there's no rational way to defend a moral oughtness. He says, I don't know where to go with this. There's no rationally compelling reason for a person to be moral, which means it is either intuitive or soulish or mystical, and whichever way you want to go, it is no longer logically compelling. So I say the only way to make a logically compelling argument for me for good and evil is to make a logically compelling argument that this is transcendental, and the only way it can be if God Himself has created us as creatures of intrinsic worth. And if that is not sustainable, the mouth has to remain silent and say there's no such thing as good or evil. We'll take that as the last one, ma'am.
Okay, hey. Thank you very much for letting me ask you a question, and also just for coming, because I really appreciate it a lot. If God created man the way that He created us each individually, and He knows, obviously, what He made in us, because He made us, and He created the environment that we're in, and that environment sort of has an influence on our decisions and stuff, and there is predestination in the Bible, then if He gave us free will, how do we really have free will if we're like the objects of His creation?
This two poles of God's sovereignty and human responsibility. It is only a contradiction if the sovereignty is so absolute that the free will is purely in name, or it is only a contradiction if there is total sovereignty and total freedom. The fact of the matter is there isn't. Our freedom is not absolute. Our freedom is limited. There are certain parameters within which we have the freedom. It is not an absolute freedom. And God in His sovereignty has chosen to give us that limited freedom. So He is still absolutely sovereign. But let me therefore just take these two issues of God's sovereignty and human responsibility and position it the way the Bible does. It is this. The Apostle Paul says, for example, work out your own salvation, freedom of will. For it is God that worketh in you both to will and to do of His good pleasure, sovereignty of God. Work out your own salvation, responsibility of humanity. For it is God that worketh in you both to will and to do of his good pleasure, sovereignty of God. You hear this in Jesus' words. Offenses must come, sovereignty of God, but woe unto him through whom they come, responsibility of man. The Apostle Peter at his sermon in Pentecost says this, that which God hath foreordained from before the foundation of the world, sovereignty of God, you with wicked hands have taken and crucified, responsibility of man. God holds these 2 points in tension for us. And I believe it is a marvelous tension in which we need to hold it. Because every day I know I am totally dependent upon his sovereignty. But at the same time, it is not a debilitating sovereignty that takes away responsibility from me. When William Carey was going to go to India as a missionary, somebody stood up and said, if he wants them saved, he can have them saved without you. That is true. But that does not mean he has not chosen to use human instrumentality. So let us recognize that the Bible gives us these 2 points and enables us to hold them in tension. And they are not contradictory concepts because the sovereignty has granted the freedom and the freedom is limited. I cannot take the freedom to create other options. For example, I cannot say that I can reject Christ and still be eternally in heaven. That's not an option for me. There is a limited effect there's a limited choice I have. The effects are built into those choices. So I've very plainly said, that with God had joined together, let no man put asunder. He has taught us that he is sovereign. He has reminded us that we have a responsibility. Let me give you one simple illustration and then I'll be seated. And I will get my hair turning black again after this the strain of these several days. I was visiting the city of Varanasi in India, which is a magnificent Hindu city. It is old and all of that, but it's known for its silk saris, the best silk saris in the world. In fact, all generally wedding saris are bought from Varanasi. Growing up there, you'd say, you used to call it Banaras and Banarsi silk sari. I saw how they are made. I'd never seen them until that point. It's generally made by a father and son team. The father sits on a platform, 2 steps below sits the son. Every 2 minutes or so, he'll gather a combination of these threads, hold them together, and he'll nod, and the son sitting 2 steps below will move the shuttle from the right to the left. He gets another set of threads, nods, the son moves it from the left to the right. The only thing the son does is respond to the nod of the father, right to left, left to right. The entire pattern is in the mind of the father, and as it unfolds, you see the pattern that is being designed in his mind. The son is just moving the shuttle right to left. Does not take too much to do that, but thankfully he does, and he delights in the pattern that he sees emerging. That's our relationship to God. When we stand before him, we will see the magnificent pattern that was in his mind, and we'll just say, but for the grace of God, I would never have been here. So respond to his revealed word and move when he asks you to move, stop when he asks you to stop. The best way is to live with that moral law. He will build a beautiful pattern. God bless you. Thank you.
How you doing?
Very well, thanks.
Good.
I'll find out in a minute. Go ahead.
Well, I got a lot from what you said tonight, so
thanks so much.
Sirs. But there's been a question that's really simple, and it's been troubling me for some time, and it's just that for God to be the creator, your father, your friend. Is he at all concerned about your happiness?
Great question. That is, there's a book that I have written called The Cries of the Heart, in which I raise one chapter on that very almost verbatim the way you have raised it. And it comes from the mouth of Job. And it also comes in the New Testament where the person talks about one being born blind, Does God really feel? There is such a thing as the theologians will talk about the passivity of God. that somehow God is distant in his feeling response to you and me, and whether he is concerned about what happens in this world. I would suggest to you that if you're able to pick that up, go through it in detail, but let me respond as briefly as I can and somehow touch the nerve of your question. It is this, that when we use language, we use it in three ways. Thomas Aquinas reminded us of this. We use language univocally, we use language equivocally, we use language analogically. Let me explain the terms. When we use language univocally, we are meaning the same thing when we use the word in two different sentences. If I say that I love you, and I say my brother loves you too, you will understand the word to basically mean the same thing. You won't start probing it unless you have questions of the way that has been expressed. You're not going to say, I wonder if these mean two different things. No, it's a univocal usage, one-on-one. Now, an equivocal use of the same illustration would be something like this, as I illustrated before. If you ask me, are you a good tennis player? And I say yes. And a few hours later, you're on a plane and somebody's sitting next to you. You say, what's your name? And he says, I'm Roger Federer. And you say, what do you do for a living, sir? He says, I play tennis. And you say, are you a good player, Mr. Federer? And he says, yes, I'm a good player. You'd make a huge mistake in saying, I think you need to play Ravi Z, because he also says he's a good player. It's the same word, but a completely different context. And so it's a different context, giving it a whole new meaning of what it means to be a good tennis player. So you use it univocally, use it equivocally, but then you also use it analogically. When I tell you that God loves you, and then I tell you I love you, it's the same word, but has a different implication. When I love you and you refuse to love me, I hurt because I have lost something. When God loves you and you refuse to love God, God hurts too. God hurts because you have lost something. That's the analogical use. He is concerned. That's why he sent his son to die on the cross. The Bible tells how Jesus went to the top of a mountain and he looked at a city and he wept over it. When he saw his friend Lazarus was dead, he wept over that. But remember this. The God who created you and me is the same God who is able to restore you and me. So when I see somebody who's lost his life, I would weep for a completely different reason, because I cannot restore that life. But when Christ wept, he knew he was going to restore the life of Lazarus, but he wept for you and for me, knowing the pain that comes from observing death and observing separation, even though he was going to restore that life. So the concern is there with the power to restore that which was lost. And when you are in pain or suffering or whatever it is, that same God gives you the strength to endure it. I lost my mother fairly young in life. I lost my father fairly young in life. And I've had some serious issues that I've had to wrestle with even physically. As I stand before you, I've got 2 metal rods holding my back up, which I injured very seriously some years ago. And I found through all of this, his grace is sufficient. A woman who was blind and cancerous and arthritic and orphaned wrote these words, He giveth more grace when the burdens grow greater. He sendeth more strength when the labors increase. To added affliction he addeth his mercy. To multiplied trials his multiplied peace. When we have exhausted our store of endurance, when our strength has failed ere the day is half done, when we reach the end of our hoarded resources, our Father's full giving has only begun. His love has no limit, his grace has no measure, his power has no boundaries known unto men. For out of his infinite riches in Jesus he giveth and giveth and giveth again. He cares and he gives. And one of the ways this world will know that he cares is if you and I, if we know him and love him, go and extend that caring hand to somebody who needs it. We then embody that truth, not just in words, but we do it in action.
Hello, my name is Steve, and I'm from Statesboro, Georgia. What is the nature of the hope of professing Christians who have indeed experienced God in the past, but are presently experiencing a lull or a hiding of God's face? Can a difference between this and a true loss of faith be articulated? The psalmist who says, how long, O Lord, will you hide your face? Jesus from the cross who says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Or maybe two disciples on the road to Emmaus who say, we thought it was him who is going to restore the kingdom. Can those men be men of faith? And what would you say to a believer who's suffering that kind of situation?
I think there's an important point to be made here. The question as you phrase it is to do with feeling, how close you feel God is, that sense of relationship with him. The point I was making in my talk was that first and foremost, faith is a response to a God who is real and true. In other words, you can't let your feelings dictate what the truth of the situation is when it comes to this. You have to let the truth really ultimately dictate to your feelings, which is what obviously the psalmist does when he's crying out, awaken my soul within me, and so on. I think the writer who I know who's best described what you're talking about is a guy called C.S. Lewis. And I'm sure you're familiar with his book, The Screwtape Letters, where in that book, if you're not familiar with it, it's a story about a senior devil in hell writing to a junior devil on earth, giving him some advice about how best to make people's life a misery. And one of them is on precisely this issue. And what he says is, look, he's writing to this junior devil saying, look, don't be excited right now that the person you're looking after feels that God is distant from them. Okay, that's not a cause for celebration. Because he said, have you never heard of the law of undulation? He said, which is that these human beings, although their hearts are in eternity, that's where the source of their hope is, they live through a passage of time while they're here. And it goes up and down. He said, and when they're going down through the down, don't think necessarily that they're letting go of God. It may be that during that time, they may ultimately come closest to him. When the Apostle Paul was writing to the Corinthians, he said, and it's very interesting he said this because he's writing a letter to defend his leadership. People accusing him of being weak, that he's not a strong enough Christian to be a leader, whereas they're very strong, they don't have any problems, so they should reject Paul as their leader and embrace these other super apostles. And he says, you heard that I had some troubles in Asia. He says, I don't want you to be uninformed, my brothers, about the trouble I had in Asia. He said, it went so deep that I despaired of life itself. Now, I've read that statement many times, and I've often thought about it. To me, it sounds almost suicidal. He's writing a letter to defend his leadership to a church who think he isn't strong enough. And he starts off at the very beginning by saying, you heard I had difficulty in Asia. Let me tell you how difficult it was. I despaired of life itself. And then he says, but in this I rejoice. Now, have you ever read that about if you're familiar with the Christian faith where Paul talks about rejoicing in suffering, have you ever wondered why he talks about that? I mean, was he sort of slightly mentally disturbed? He saw suffering coming, he saw pain coming, he saw depression coming, and he went, whoo, pain. I love pain. God, thank you for sending me this great trial. He doesn't rejoice in the tribulation that he's going through for the sake of it. He rejoices because he knows what ultimately may be produced by it. He says, yet in all of this I'm able to rejoice, for this taught me to trust not in myself nor in anyone else, but only in him. In other words, everything else was taken from him. He despaired of life itself. But the one thing that remained, the one hope he still had after all of that had been taken away, was Christ. And so, if you're here and you're in that situation, where you once knew that Christ was near, yet he now seems far, what you have to remember is that your hope is secure. Now, if he's far because you've turned away from him, you just need to turn. If you're seeking for him and yet he still seems far, then don't despair. Because C.S. Lewis makes the observation that the Christians who've served him the greatest have gone through down deeper, darker, and longer troughs than anyone else, yet come up the other side, shining for him. Now, what I was saying in my talk was that there are some people who have never known that. Not who once knew and now have lost it, but have never known. And you can't lose what you never had. And so at some point you have to ask yourself the question, do I feel like this because this is something I never knew and I'm actually looking for it? I was with a man last week and we talked for hours. I said, I don't think you're a Christian. I've never seen a man look so relieved in my whole life. He said, oh, I'm so glad you said that. I've been trying to be one for 35 years and this is it. I'm not interested. So we talked a bit more and then he said, can we talk some more? I'd like to find out. For him, the step to getting to the truth was to realize for the first time that even though he'd been born, raised, and gone to church every single Sunday of the year, and that was the start of discovery. But for the one who once knew, who's lost it, you're now in a different situation. It either can be because you've turned from him, or it simply may be that you're going through a trough, everything's been stripped away, just like it was for the Apostle Paul, and one day you will shine very brightly for him. And that's a source for hope, and it's in that Paul rejoiced.
I recommend the book by Os Guinness called God in the Dark. It's an excellent book that I think you will find as he is wrestling with these very questions, how it is that he emerges from the scene of doubting. My suggestion is this: there's a difference between doubting and questioning. When you question your faith, you take one step back. When you doubt, you want to take all the steps back as if you don't believe anything anymore. Questioning your faith is a common thing if you want to put heart and mind together. Doubting it is another thing. If you're in doubt, then you've got some serious questions about the person and the work of Christ. If you've got a question, then you're dealing with the peripheral issues of how it's explained. Let me give you one parable and we'll close. It's a Jewish parable of Elijah going with the rabbi into a home, a very poor family that had a cow that was very thin, miserable. But this poor family entertained him for the night, gave him bread and milk and butter and all. And in the morning as he was leaving, one of the walls collapsed out there and the prophet moved on. They stay in a rich man's house the next night and he gives them all the fat of the land and so on. And before he leaves, Elijah has a wall rebuilt for him and walks away. The rabbi says, I don't understand it. We're that poor man. He fed us all they had. And in the morning we wake up, that wall collapses and you walk away. Here we're at a rich man's home. He gives you so much and you rebuild a wall for him. He said, yes. It was decreed that next day that he was going to lose his wife. And I interceded and God answered by preserving his wife. He was going to lose the wall. Together they would rebuild the wall. The rich man lived with his greed. His wall was breaking down and he was going to rebuild it himself. But behind that broken wall was a huge pot of gold. And if he'd rebuilt it himself, he'd have found that pot of gold. Now I've rebuilt it. He won't go beyond it. He will never find it. And God has settled the balance so that he won't go after the riches any more than he should. When you look at that, think of the contingencies of life. There are so many things in life we don't know. When we meet him face to face, we'll find out why some walls fell and some walls were rebuilt. And there was an eternal purpose to it. Time is a speck in the sea of eternity. And God explains it all. Thank you so much for coming and thank you for organizing.
Well, I'm not a Christian, so hopefully that's okay.
For the moment, yes.
Yeah. For the moment. Okay. I appreciate your boldness, for sure. But I studied a little bit of Christianity and orthodoxy and that sort of thing, and I was wondering, you mentioned the necessity of a belief system to be empirically verifiable.
Yes.
That correct? In the light of the Christian Orthodox doctrine of the noetic effects of sin, how is it possible to gain evidence which supports Christianity?
Oh, my. To be honest with you, I do not know of anything more empirically verifiable. When you're talking about the noetic effects of sin, how the mind itself is affected. Malcolm Muggeridge said, the depravity of man is at once the most empirically verifiable, but the most intellectually resisted. Can you not see evil? That's the effect. That's the noetic effect of sin. So when you see the debauchery of human life, lust, greed, pride, the callousness with which we treat each other, so that is a very empirically verifiable doctrine and very much manifested. So I appreciate, please give me a name.
Riley.
Riley, the empirical evidence existentially is not deniable. What some may deny is whether the categories we are using are right. They may not want to call it evil, but they will certainly say that violence and nature red in tooth and claw type thing is evidence. So when I'm talking about empirical verifiability, I'm talking about its foundations from which emerge these doctrines. And the foundations are the person, life, death, resurrection of Jesus Christ. The Bible is both a book on geography and a book on history. If anything historically was asserted that is empirically false, you have a reason to say this is falsifiable very easily. On the other hand, when the geography is accurate, when the history is accurate, that is what I call by empirical adequacy. And the empirical, it would be a tougher question for you if you said, where is the empirical evidence for transformation? That is that you see more difficulty with and say, I see a lot of Christians who are hypocritical. But the noetic effects of sin is incontrovertible, and I think very evident in human history. That's one thing that even somebody like Darwin, a scientific naturalist, Nietzsche, philosophical naturalist, both of them said, Darwin said, if his scientific theory of natural selection holds true, the metaphysical extensions of it are going to be deadly, meaning violence unparalleled. That is what he would call naturalistically demonstrable. I would say to you, that is a moral pronouncement, and it's metaphysics. It is not physics at that point. And the metaphysics is that the mind has been affected by the fall of humanity in rejecting God.
Okay, my understanding in terms of empiricism is that we gain true knowledge by our senses. That's the way to gain true knowledge. Am I wrong in
no,
saying
it is partly, but I think if you go to empiricism, you're looking at people like Berkeley and Hume and others, and when Hume talks about the fact that nothing is first known in the mind that does not first come through the senses. But what Hume challenged in his empiricism was that metaphysical pronouncements had any meaning. And so David Hume questioned that, if you remember. But he went on to make this rather horrendous statement that buried his own philosophy. He said, if you take in your hand a book on metaphysics, ask, does it contain any statement of fact about reality? Does it contain any experimental knowledge of reality? If the answer is no, toss it then into the flames. It is nothing but sophistry and falsehood. Well, the problem is that statement itself is then nothing but sophistry and falsehood, because it is not mathematical or experimental. So empiricism covers those two angles, that which is mathematically demonstrable and that which is verifiable by the repetition or within the senses of human experience. So I would say the empirical measurement of a fallen mind is very much verifiable just by the evidence that you see of human behavior.
My question to you would be in two parts. First, if truth is exclusive, as you assert, then what would be the value of interfaith dialogue in which mutually exclusive truth claims are at odds with one another? First part. Second part, what do we do then with the mutually exclusive truth claims that we find?
Great question. My answer to you is interfaith dialogue is very critical in our times. I engage in it. I was in Jerusalem some months ago, met with one of the founders of Hamas. We were part of a team of 6, and some of the sheikhs who are quite deep into the throes of the whole Palestinian struggle and all. We met with rabbis, and I have dialogued with, when I wrote my book, Lotus on the Cross, I dialogued with Buddhist priests and so on. Interfaith dialogue is very important because it puts a face behind the belief. Very often we castigate belief as if it is disembodied ideas. We need to know that there are people who believe them. And in a pluralistic society, it is very important that we talk, because as we talk, we at least learn to find out what the other person believes and why they believe it. And I think in interfaith dialogue, one of the greatest converts to the Christian faith was a Chinese scholar by the name of Chang Lit-sun. And Chang Lit-sun was a leader in the Confucian and then the Buddhist movement for many, many years. He went to deliver a paper at a World Congress on those religions and ethical systems. And it was during that time that he found Christ in his life as he was compelled to study the person of Jesus Christ. Interfaith dialogue is good so long as it doesn't assume that you're compromising your authority and your belief. I will never compromise my belief in the person of Christ or the scriptures unless somebody can show me by what I'm believing that I'm believing something that is self-contradictory. Then I would be open to examine. So interfaith dialogue compels you to rethink. I was in Bethlehem, Israel, and one of the well-known professors there, Adnan, is a head of the Department of Religious Studies there. He asked me if I would come and speak to an interfaith group there at Bethlehem. They meet once a week and quite regularly, the various groups. He's a devout Christian, And he's not surrendered it, but he talks and talks because it opens up an honest person to their own assumptions. So long as you know what the parameters are and you're willing, Anthony Flew, the atheist I mentioned, when he was asked why he gave up atheism, he said, you've got to go where the evidence leads. You've got to go where the evidence leads. He was quoting the Socratic maxim. You have got to go where the evidence leads. And in interfaith dialogue, if somebody is disagreeing with you and justifiably defends their point, you have to go where the evidence leads. Number two, what about mutually exclusive claims? I go to the Middle East all the time. I'll be this year, I'll be in Syria, I'll be in, Lord willing, I'll be in Saudi Arabia this year. And go there all the time. And I dialogue with Muslim scholars. And I keep asking them some questions, they keep asking me some questions. I do not believe in the Quran because I believe there are many statements made about the Christian faith that are wrong in there. And I present that to them. They ought not to get upset with me for presenting that, and they haven't. They'll dialogue with me. For example, I've said to them, in the 4th surah, it tells me that Jesus never died on the cross. Is that true? They'll say it's true. I'll say, why is it that Greek historians, Roman historians, Jewish historians, pagan historians, every historian agrees that he died? Every historian agrees that he was crucified. There's dating for it. There's evidence for it. Why do you lay a claim like this that he didn't die on the cross? And we dialogue this. And I think when mutually exclusive claims come, and here's where the thorny side of your question is very critical, because in a country like Canada, we're facing these issues right now. Unless the Canadian political theory and Western political theory, listen to me very carefully, understands the worldview that allowed such a country to come into being, we will ultimately be overrun by other beliefs that will change the philosophical basis of a land such as this, and then it has been lost. It's as real as it is. Pluralism must not mean relativism. There are some absolutes that no culture can sacrifice. If you go to an Islamic country, there are some absolutes they will not sacrifice to you. I respect their right to do so. You go to India, there are some absolutes they will not sacrifice to you. I respect their right to do so. And we dialogue and debate. But why is it in the West we have come to the conclusion that the Western world ought to give up its metaphysical scaffolding, and all of a sudden legal theories, philosophical theories, moral theories are rushing in? The West needs to understand nature abhors a vacuum. And if we evict the Christian faith, another faith will take hold. And I'll guarantee you with that statement, it will. So we have to know absolutes in dialogue, and beyond which we will not go. Does that mean we disrespect one another and cease to live with each other? The answer is no. We must learn to respect the other person. But there are scaffoldings that I believe in my life which I will not compromise. And I don't think cultures ought to either.
What answer can you give a man who is dying of hunger and no hope for next day, and present him the truth?
It's a good question, and I think the first thing you need to remember that in that kind of situation is that everybody has the option of an answer. If you were to ask one person with a certain worldview, he would probably say, you're going to become nothing, life has no meaning, goodbye, this is the way it is, and that would be sort of the naturalist, the materialistic worldview. Somebody else might say, well, you know, you lived a life, this is what you deserved from your previous life, and when you come in another form, maybe you will be better off. That's the way one answer might go. I would, if I were by him, I'd hold his hand, I'd sit down there, talk to him, and express my deep sadness for the pain that he had endured, to realize that it was a very genuine pain, and then remind him of 2 or 3 things. To tell him that there walked the streets of the world a man by the name of Jesus Christ, who said that those who ministered to such people and took care of them were doing it even as unto him. He himself went to a cross and suffered and was in pain and in agony and did that for him. that he didn't just leave his condition unaddressed. He reached out and identified with the suffering one. Jesus himself, in fact, was called the suffering servant. The word in English that we call excruciating comes from two Latin words, excruciatus, which literally means out of the cross. And I would talk to this man about the cross of Jesus Christ and the suffering that God himself endured because of the wickedness and the hostility in which his son had lived. But then I would say to him that greater than physical hunger is the hunger of the soul. And I would offer him to the bread of life and tell him he could live with complete hope, that knowing that his security was not based purely on the material, but his security was based on the fact that God would give him eternal life and be waiting for him in that presence of his own children and his own angelic beings, what heaven talks about, the welcome that God gives to us for those who die having that hope in him. I could tell him then the story that is so often told in the New Testament of a young man who'd gone away and run away from home and finally found out when all was lost that there was somebody who still loved him. And as he was returning home, the Father was standing there with open arms, welcoming him to receive him. And I would say to him, if you're willing to give your life over to him who loves you and took the suffering for you and offers you forgiveness, who gives you the bread of life, he's waiting for you. You're not just going, you are going home, and your Heavenly Father is waiting to receive you. That hope the Christian has, the naturalist does not.
Here is the next question. I am an optimist. Why do you think I need God?
Well, that's a good question, but I'm not quite sure how you define an optimist. Do you define an optimist as one who has a bright feeling even though everything he believes is not true? Or one who has a bright feeling because it is based on the facts? I like what G.K. Chesterton said about pessimism. He said there's a difference between pessimism and sorrow. He said pessimism is based on the value of nothing. Sorrow is based on the true value of something. And so the question is really not whether you're an optimist or a pessimist. The question is whether you are a realist. And what's real? You know, you can be facing a bomb squad and actually tell you this is just marshmallows coming my way, and be a real optimist, and you'll find out it wasn't a marshmallow, it was a bomb coming in your direction. If you are an optimist, what do you have to say about the reality of the four questions of life? Origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. Optimism is a condition of the mind. It's not a reflection of truth. It is truth that you need to know, not have a woozy feeling about reality. Optimism is a great feeling, but you can even be laughing while the plane is going down, but the plane is going down. You have to answer life's questions, not dismiss it with a feeling. So optimism can be a mood and a mindset that is in violation of reality. Now, if you're an optimist because you have everything contained in reality, then you have reason to hope. But your question didn't say that. Your question said, why should I believe in God if for no other reason? Because He exists. Next one.
Here is a very interesting question. The gentleman says, I accept the illusions you have spoken about, but how do I know that the one you proposed is not an illusion?
Very good question. Good thinking. Truth is not a characteristic of feeling. Truth is a characteristic of propositions. In the beginning was the Word. Not in the beginning was video. Not in the beginning was a feeling of optimism. In the beginning was the Word. Which means you and I, as distinctive entities, are creatures who deal with propositional reality. It is not just a world that is out there. We verbalize a reality that is in here, and then we take that reality in words which must reflect what is outside. So when we say something is an illusion, we are demonstrating in that fact that the statement of what the person says he or she believes is contrary to what we can measure to be true. The more you test out reality, the more you find out what the tests of reality are. And let me tell you this, that the ultimate tests of truth are two: the correspondence theory of truth and the coherence theory of truth. Correspondence is that which ultimately corresponds to reality in single affirmations. If I say to you that I came in a blue car this evening that is parked right outside in front of this main entrance there, you're not going to say, I wonder what he means by a blue car and main entrance. If all these terms are understood, you can empirically verify it, and you may even be able to falsify it. You may say, Ravi, you're not telling me the truth. I saw you coming in an auto rickshaw somewhere, and I saw you getting off the side door. In other words, you're taking two tests. You're taking that which is empirically measurable, and you're taking that which is empirically falsifiable. So the correspondence theory of truth is the test number one. It's used in every court of law. It's used in every testimony. Then there is the coherence theory of truth. The coherence theory of truth does not apply to single statements. It applies to the cumulative whole of all the statements asserted. In a court of law, when you're judging somebody, you use the correspondence test and you use the coherence test. When a man or woman makes a certain claim, you measure it by verifiable principles. When the whole story is put together, you look to see if there's any systemic contradiction or something that is falling apart that does not cohere with another statement. So the correspondence theory and the coherence theory, that is the first basis of truth.
In line with that, there was a gentleman who asked, he said, my son has said, I will wait to see who wins, God or Allah, before I make up my mind. What would you say to a father who's wanting to nurture and disciple and lead his son?
Well, the first thing I'd want to know if he really was being serious, or was he just saying this in some cavalier way? So I would ask him a lot of questions. I would ask him what he knows about Allah and what he knows about God. First of all, in the Arabic, it's the same word. It's not a different word. So what he's really talking about is the attributes of the God of the Judeo-Christian faith vis-a-vis the attributes of the Allah presented in the Quran. And if he is really serious, then I would say to him, why don't you evaluate the two attributes and you tell me which one coheres with a righteous, moral, loving first cause. For example, can the Quran be true when it denies the crucifixion of Jesus? When Jewish historians, Roman historians, Greek historians, pagan historians, all historians agree on the crucifixion of Jesus. And the Quran denies that he was even crucified. Where was Muhammad after he died? Where was Jesus after he died? One atheist wrote recently that he's dancing on the grave of God. Well, he can dance on the grave of the Christian God. There's nobody there. He rose again from the dead. The whole nature of the two divine entities presented is very different. And I could go into a lot of detailed description here. But let me just tell you one story that'll thrill your heart. And I hate to take so much of time, but sometimes the story does more than a million words would. My wife and I were in a country where a Muslim guy who had come over from Iraq had crossed over. I don't know if you've heard me tell this story. And he said he used to make false passports for a living, and he learned how to kill without feeling. One day he had a dream about Jesus, that he was the way, the truth, and the life. 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. Every night he had the same dream, that Jesus was the way, the truth, and life. He went and told his mother. His mother said, don't you dare tell your brothers, they will kill you. He said, I'm not becoming a Christian. She said, I know, but don't tell them, they will kill you. 2 years, 3 years, he's having the same dream. She tells him to get out of the country. They're going to kill him. So he gets out. And he gets out of the country, and he comes to this other land where we had dinner with him one night. 7 years in a row, he has the same dream. And he meets up with this Christian businessman, and he says, the hound of heaven is on your trail. He's following you. He committed his life to Jesus Christ. He was now studying in a seminary in that country, studying to prepare to go back to Iraq. I said, how do you plan to get back? He said, I make passports. And he was planning to return. And what I have told you now, there are thousands of men and women who are finding Christ in those very similar situations. And I think if Islam needs to be taken seriously, they should give their people the freedom to believe or disbelieve. And when you compare the Quran with the Bible, many Muslims will tell you they don't understand most of the Quran. It's incomprehensible. A lot of it is incomprehensible. And there are many other reasons we could give you. But Allah and God in the Arabic is the same word. So you're really looking for two different attributes. And I would say Jesus said, to come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And I think the answers of Christ correspond with reality far more than either Muhammad's or anyone. Compare the two lives. Compare the two lives. I said to a Muslim in Indonesia, I said, if I came to you with multiple wives, one of whom was 9 or 11 years old, would you take me seriously that I had the answer to all of life? And he said, well, we have to think about these things. I don't understand it. We have to look at these things very seriously because it determines our destiny. I know those are strong words, but you have to look at the life of Christ and compare it with these others, and you will see the difference.
One final question that has a couple of parts, and then we will be done, we'll close. But if Christ's sacrifice was indeed unique, which is one question, then what about those who've never heard about his sacrifice? And what about those who've never heard about Jesus regarding their ultimate destiny and salvation?
In his talk to the Athenians, Paul says, the God who made the world and everything in it, the heaven and earth, does not live in temples. He's not served by human hands. From one man he made every nation of men that they should inhabit the whole earth. He determined the time set for them and the exact places where they should live. God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. So God says that your placing in life where you were is well within his plan, and he's not far from any one of us in ways that he reveals himself. We just see it and hear it time and time again. You can be sure that he knows how he will judge each individual with fairness, because the Bible says right in the passage of Sodom and Gomorrah, shall not the judge of all the earth do right? But anyone who enters heaven will enter heaven because of the sacrifice of the blood of Christ, not because of their own merit or any intrinsic innocence of their own. Yes, sir.
You spoke of the exclusivity of Christianity and the notion that we can only truly come to know God through knowing Jesus. I'm sure in your travels you've been to many places where a lot of the people haven't even heard of Jesus Christ, much less seen a Bible. I'm just wondering whether God gives all the people of the earth the possibility to know God through Jesus, and if so, how does he do it?
Here's what I want to read for you from Acts chapter 17. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything, because he himself gives all men life and breath and everything else. From one man he made every nation of men, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he determined the time set forth for them and the exact places where they should live. God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. Your question is a very deep question which has been asked for many, many decades. We ask it. I ask it as a proclaimer. Sometimes I go into a city or a place where people have not heard anything like what you're presenting. We hear them say that and so on. God reminds us in his word and in many illustrations of history that he is able to bypass even the human mechanism in order to speak to men and women. And he does this not only through public proclaimers. Now with the television and media and the written page and all of that, people can read about him in various places, never having heard a preacher or never having come into contact with the church or whatever. And one of the most remarkable things, and I want to tell you this, one of the most remarkable things I've heard as I travel is the parts of the world in which God has spoken many times through dreams and visions. It's happened in India, it's happened in Iran, it's happened in places of the world that I could name for you. And let me give you just one simple illustration to sustain what I'm saying, because it only demonstrates for us that He is near people who truly call upon Him. I was in a country, I'll have to leave this unnamed, but my wife and I were invited for dinner by a man who came from a very troubled part of the world, the majority, 99-point-something% of whom are Muslim people. And this fellow asked if he could have dinner with us. He'd read some of my books, and a Chinese Christian businessman brought him to meet my wife and me. It's such a fascinating story that it's worthy of repetition here. He only introduced himself with a name that he said is not my real name. He said, I belong to the army of my country. I have been trained to kill without feelings. So that was my training. My brother is a general in that army. He said, Mr. Ravi, for 7 years in a row, every night, I had a dream of Jesus. He said, 7 years in a row I had the dream, and my mother told me, get out of here or your brothers will kill you. He said, I'm not going to become a Christian. She said, that's all right. You're having this dream, they'll see what's going to happen, you get out of here. He said, I left there, and I have arrived here, met this Chinese businessman, he talked to me, we became friends. He said, I have committed my life now to Jesus Christ. The question is a profound one, but I truly and sincerely believe what the Bible says. You shall search for me and find me when you shall search for me with all your heart. It is not the volume of content that you need, as much of the intent on your heart that cries out and says, God, I need you, save me. And I believe He reveals Christ to you, principally through His Word, or through some other person, or through a vision, or through a dream, and brings you to Himself. There's a book written called Persian Springs, which counts 12 different testimonies in the same way that I've given to you. So I just say to you that as rich a question as it is, God has ways of reaching people. And I truly believe the judge of all the earth will do right. To whom much is given, much shall be required. And I think God will judge you in the light of what He has revealed to you and what you know to be true.